Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's Information Studies 650 lecture about digital preservation. So here are our weekly topics for this week. What is digital preservation? So talking about what it is, but also emphasizing some connections that digital preservation has with other aspects of archival administration, which in a lot of ways are similar to some of the connections that we talked about between analog preservation and other aspects of archival administration. I will talk about some of the major issues associated with preserving digital information. That's something that the Belt article especially touched on. What are some of the methods for preserving digital information? So again, the Belt article did a pretty good job of describing those. We'll just go into a little more detail there. And how has the evolution of digital preservation been influenced by analog preservation? So looking at some of the overlaps between digital preservation and analog preservation, which the Harvey article especially emphasized. So we will talk about those a little bit as well. And looking at 4 of our course learning objectives, so defining digital preservation, which is a core concept. We'll talk about the role that records creators play in the construction of social memory, especially when it comes to how the actions by records creators influence what archives have to do when preserving digital records. As I touched on, we'll look at some of the connections between digital preservation and other aspects of archival practice. And obviously, the whole discussion surrounding digital preservation is related to the changing nature of records, right? Going from a world where all records were analog to a world where more and more, a larger percentage of the records being created and sent to archives are digital in nature. So that spurred archives to spend a lot of time and money and effort uh, discovering, in some instances on the fly, how to preserve this new type of record. I mean, digital records have been around since the 70s, but it's still an issue that a lot of archives don't really have much of a plan as far as how to address digital records. So it's kind of an ongoing conversation and discussion. Okay, so next we'll look at the definition of digital preservation from the Harvey and Mahart article. So the series of actions and interventions required to ensure continued and reliable access to authentic digital objects for as long as they are deemed to be of value. We'll go ahead and emphasize a couple of points here. So series of actions and interventions. We talked last week about how preservation can a lot of times be a pretty passive process. A lot of instances you're just going to put something in a room that's hopefully reasonably well climate controlled, meet some of the conditions that we talked about when we described the ideal conditions for records to thrive in. And, that's pretty much going to be it. You might do the occasional preservation survey and so on, but typically it's a pretty passive process in, the instance of probably 75 or 80% of the records that come into archives. But digital preservation, because of the fragile nature of physical media, because of the fragile nature of the records themselves, requires a lot more action and intervention on the behalf of the archivist. So it's a much more active type of preservation than analog preservation. Okay, so the next thing they'll emphasize here is authentic digital objects. So we've talked about authenticity before, the idea that if a record is what it says it is, if it says it was created by an individual, and that in fact is true, then that makes a record authentic. So you can trace a chain of custody back to the individual that created it. There are other things that you can look at to tell if a record was actually created by the person that that claims to have created the record. And digital preservation, as we'll talk about in just a little bit, and as our readings touch on, can create challenges to the authenticity of digital records in a lot of ways. Some of the preservation strategies that archivists engage in order to preserve digital records can undermine this authenticity. It can result in archivists influencing what a record looks like and feels like, and how a record behaves when a researcher interacts with it, and that can undermine the claim of record as being created by a particular individual, because the archivists actually have some creative role as well. And lastly, the sense of for as long as they are deemed to be of value. So this goes back to the idea of reappraising records to make sure that they still belong in an archive and that they still are receiving the level of care and preservation that is equal to their value and their worth to researchers. So you can see some connections between digital preservation and appraisals I just touched on, and this idea that digital preservation isn't something that just starts and stops once. It's something that continues for as long as the records are around. And we'll connect that to our ideas of the archival continuum towards the end of this lecture. Okay, we'll start out by looking at some of the goals of digital preservation. So the goals of digital preservation are for the content and context of records to be available to researchers in the future. So pretty similar to analog preservation, right? And the idea is that the record that a researcher views, in the reading room or from the comfort of their own home, resembles as much as possible the record that was submitted by an archival donor when a donation was made to an archive, so that there are very little changes between point A and point B. And as we'll talk about later on in this lecture, that's not always or even commonly possible, in that archivists may need to make some changes to the content of the record in order to sustain and promote the long-term survivability of digital records in archival care. Another goal of digital preservation is that the context of records survives as well. So throughout this course, we've talked a lot about how archives need to preserve and make accessible not just the content of records, but the context as well. So the who, what, where, when, and why. And that's just as important with digital records as it is with analog records. In fact, it might be more important for digital records because, as our readings touch on, and as we'll talk about, digital records can and often are changed quite easily. And so that can result in what a researcher experiences being quite different from the record that was originally created and used by whoever created the record. And so it's important that archives have an understanding of the original environment that that record was created in. So what was the original format of the record? What were the significant properties of the record when it was created? And we'll talk about those in a little bit. What software, what computers were used when the computer was being used by the person that created it? How is the record changed over time? Where did the record come from? So all these bits of information in the form of metadata provide the contextual knowledge that allow researchers to evaluate the records that they're looking at and working with, and allows them to just have a better understanding of what the record was like when it was originally created and what the record that they're looking before them is like, and how that might have changed between the time that the records were donated to the archives and between the time that the researcher is looking at the record, again, in the reading room or from home or however they're doing so. one interesting thing that the Hedstrom article especially focuses on is this idea of significant properties. So the Hedstrom article describes significant properties as the features, attributes, or properties that impinge upon future use and understanding of a record. And the Hedstrom article suggests that the significant properties of a record warrant ongoing preservation due to their importance in understanding or using or interpreting a digital object. And so again, it's important that this contextual information about records is captured so that researchers can see, okay, we see that the significant properties of this record at one point were this and this and this, and now we see that those might have changed over time. And again, it just provides an additional layer of understanding that that a researcher has when looking at digital records and evaluating them for potential use. Where things get a little hazy or confusing is what a significant property is might differ from person to person. So a significant property for researcher A might be different from a significant property for researcher B. And so it can be difficult for archives to say, well, we really need to focus on preserving this and this and this within a record where, you know, this and this and this might be important for one researcher, but not necessarily another researcher. And so that speaks to the need for archivists to work with researchers to have a better understanding of what the significant properties of records are. And it also speaks of the importance of archives working with records creators and donors to understand what the significant properties of a record are. Because the person that created the record or used the record is probably going to have a pretty good understanding of what the most important aspects or parts of a record are. And so that gives the archivist an idea of what information to try and preserve and what information to make sure that archives are passing on to researchers that are going to use archival records in the future. So again, just sort of overall, you know, the big challenge or the big goals of digital preservation are, you know, similar to analog preservation to maintain the content and context of records. But again, with digital records, where it gets more complicated is that the content and context of records can be easily changed, and in fact, frequently is changed by archives in order to sustain the preservation of digital objects into the future. Okay, so real quick, we'll look at some preservation metadata. This is from some records that I put into a digital preservation program called Droid, which the Velt article touches on. It's a really great, neat little program where you feed it some records and it will extract all this information from records. You know, it'll spit them out in a nice Excel file so that you have this metadata, and some of this can be extremely useful. So a couple of things I'll emphasize is, so this will be the date of creation of the record. So that's a good way to kind of understand the who, what, where, when, and why. This will tell you the format of the record. You know, this will tell you if you're looking at a file or a folder. This right here is fixity information, and fixity is something that we looked at in the last slide as being contextual information. And so this is something that the Velt article touches on as well. So this is just an alphanumeric code that is unique to each record. So kind of like a person's social security number. And you can use this as a basis for establishing fixity in a record. So if you run Droid and it spits out this alphanumeric code, and then you run another program, later on down the line to check the fixity again. And for some reason, some of these hashes have changed. Then that will tell you that for whatever reason, the records that you're preserving are changed, and that you should probably look into that. So again, just additional information to let researchers understand if the records that they are looking at may have changed since they were donated to the archive, and then they can take that information into consideration. Here's just some more information about different file formats, information about how the identification of file formats was done, different versions of Adobe Acrobat. So again, just a lot of information telling researchers very specific contextual information about records. And again, this is something that archives want to preserve and keep attached to records in order to give researchers a better understanding of the context of records and how that context may have changed over time. Okay, so as you might have guessed, and it has the Velt article hopefully illustrated for you, there are a lot of challenges related to digital preservation. So a big one is the lack of resources, which the Velt article focused on. The whole article was centered on how can an archives with minimal staff and minimal resources carry out digital preservation in a reasonably advanced way. And as I've emphasized in this course, not every archive, or not even most archives, are especially well endowed with ample infrastructure and ample resources. So archives have to scrap and scrounge where they can in order to carry out what can be a substantially complex and large undertaking. And so related to this is one of the principles that the Harvey article espouts, which is advocacy is necessary to ensure preservation. So archives have to be able to demonstrate why they are important, why digital preservation is important, in order to receive the resources that they need to carry out digital preservation and really every other archival task as well. And that's something that we'll talk more about when we discuss outreach here in a few weeks. Another challenge related to digital preservation that the Velt article talked about, which is related to a lack of resources, is having a backlog of unprocessed materials. So having these materials sitting on the stacks that archives have little knowledge of. They don't know what's in these collections simply because they don't have the resources to process the records and learn more about the different records that might be in these collections. And if these records contain digital records that need to be preserved, and archives aren't aware of that, then that can result in difficulties as physical media decays, as the records on physical media decay, and you end up getting some of the bit rot and decay of physical media that the Velt article touches on. And so, this extends to my next challenge related to digital preservation, which is a lack of knowledge of records needing preservation due to poor appraisal and, as I just touched on, poor processing. The Velt article talks about, they have an inability to survey every box in a 50,000 foot collection to find out where all these potential sources of digital records might be. However, as we'll touch on later, as archives are doing appraisal sufficiently, if they are doing processing sufficiently, then there's at least a stronger likelihood that archives will be aware of these records needing digital preservation attention or intervention, and they will be able to address them. But of course, however, if they're unaware and these records, are on floppy disk drives that are 30 or 40 years old that just continue to decay and decay and decay, then that can make digital preservation more difficult and more of a resource intensive process. So a lack of staff time to devote to digital preservation, that's something that the Bell article also touched on. Essentially, they needed to hire and train a student worker to do all the stuff that they themselves didn't have time to do. A lack of staff expertise, just knowing how to carry out digital preservation in a way that doesn't harm the records. So this is related to a couple more of the principles in the Harvey article. So do no harm during preservation, and the preservation action should not exceed the abilities of the personnel who apply them. So, you don't want to get in over your head and accidentally maybe damage the original records or accidentally delete them, or there are a lot of things that could go wrong, expose them to viruses. So a lack of staff expertise can definitely potentially cause harm to records, or at the very least make digital preservation less efficient and less sufficient for researcher needs. Another challenge is a lack of developed policies. This is something the Bell article also touched on. So ideally, you have policies in place that illustrate how digital preservation is going to be carried out. So, here are the file types that we're going to migrate this type of file to. Here are the priorities that we have. All the digital preservation choices that your archives make should be spelled out so that there's uniformity in action, so that everyone knows what to do and face, with different situations. But that can be a difficult thing for archives to develop if you don't have staff time or you don't have the expertise to develop these policies. So this lack of policy can stem from a couple of different challenges that I've talked about, and also be a challenge itself. Another thing that the article is a lack of an understanding of the importance of digital preservation, so a lack of administrator buy-in, which goes back to this idea of advocacy being necessary for digital preservation that I touched on. A lack of software required to access records to even be able to begin preserving them. If a record is in a format that is very old and maybe obsolete, then it can be difficult to find a way to even access the information in the first place. A lack of an affordable one-size-fits-all digital preservation tool. So the Velt article talks about, these recommendations for tools that their archive might use, but it was going to cost like 50 grand a year, and that was just way more than they could afford. So they had to kind of develop a workflow consisting of kind of piecemeal free digital tools that when combined would do the job that maybe one tool would do, but that one tool can cost a lot of money that an archive may not have. And so just the overall complexity, the complexity of carrying out a process throughout a few different stages, which I'll touch on here in just a second. So first of all, we have the transfer stage. Apologies if you're looking at this and you're a germaphobe like I am. I think that if someone sneezed right on me, I would probably feel like I wanted to be sick. Unless it was my kids, I get sneezed on and coughed on by my kids all the time, and it just kind of rolls off my shoulders. But if it was a stranger, I would probably be like pretty repulsed, like this lady is. It's strange. My kids will be sick and they'll like cough and hack all over me and sneeze on me. And I always think, oh, well, I'm not going to get sick. I'm somehow like immune from their little kid germs. And I always get sick. And for some reason, it's surprising. I kind of like, for some reason, think I'm invincible to their little daycare germs. But they always get me in the end. Uh, you know, an important part of digital preservation is this transfer. The transfer from, it took me a while to kind of segue what I was talking about to the actual topic of this lecture, but here we go. So the transfer of records from the donor to the archive can be a problematic stage. So this is where the donor is saying, hey, I have these collections. They're either on a server or on physical media, and they're digital records. And so the archives have to be able to navigate this transfer in a way that results in information about the records being recorded, and also in a way that results in as few changes to the records during this transfer process as possible. Because again, the idea is that you want to have an understanding of what the content and context of the records are when they come into a repository, so that you're able to share that information with researchers in the future. So you want to have a transfer process that results in a capture of this content and contextual information, because that way, if things change in the future, if you migrate records or whatever, maybe there's some kind of bit rot that goes on, then you can say, well, at least we have some record of what the records look like when they first came in. So it's really important during this transfer process to get this initial snapshot of what the content and context of records was like. And again, that takes time. It takes tools. The Velt article talks about having a workstation that was disconnected from the internet, so that there wasn't any change to the files. It had a write blocker, so the files couldn't be changed. They used a program to get the metadata off of the records and make sure that survived. So yeah, it can be a pretty complex process, and if you don't have the resources to do it, or you don't really know what you're doing, then it can be more challenging. Okay, so next we have the copying stage. So this is where you're going to take your original record, you're going to put that somewhere safe, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. And then you're going to make what are called preservation copies. And so these are copies that are either direct copies of the original files, or just as commonly migrated copies of the original file. And those are the copies that researchers are going to look at down the road. But again, during this process, you don't want to kind of mix up your copies, or you don't want to damage the original record in a way that can change the content and context of that record. Because again, that's sort of your ace in the hole, that if something happens in the future, you can have this original copy that you can replace our preservation copies with. And that connects with a couple of the Harvey principles as well. So keep the originals and keep multiple copies of objects. So it's definitely another important part of the digital preservation process. But again, if you lack expertise in digital preservation, then you might carry this out in a way that is harmful to the records, or isn't as sufficient as maybe it would be otherwise. Okay, another important part of digital preservation is documentation. So this relates to the Harvey principle. Preservation actions should be documented. So as you are moving through your digital preservation process, you need to be documenting what is happening to the record. So if you're migrating records, you need to have some record of that. If you are carrying out checks to make sure that your records haven't changed, you need to document that these checks have been made. And again, this information is so that the archive can have an understanding of what has gone on with the records, and so that researchers can have an understanding as well. They can look at the metadata associated with the record and say, okay, I see here that this record was migrated from a different file format, and I'm going to take that into consideration when drawing my conclusions from this record. How records are documented is typically going to be described in your preservation policy. So if an archive doesn't have one of those, that can create challenges. If archivists aren't skilled with collecting all this information and collecting all the different processes that have gone on, then that can be problematic. So you can relate this process of documentation to some of the challenges to digital preservation that I touched on as well. Okay, and then we also have storage. So if you're making, 4 or 5 copies of every single record that comes into your repository, then that's going to take a lot of storage, right? It's going to take a lot of server space. And that can be a resource issue as well, right? So just to pay for all the server space that your digital records are going to live on for the foreseeable future. The Velt article talks about sending the original copies of records into the dark archive, which is only accessible by a few people, so that other individuals who may not have sufficient training or sufficient knowledge of digital preservation can't get in there and monkey around with all the originals. So that's related to storage as well. Having this sort of dark archive where all of your original records go to just kind of hang out. And again, that way they're there if you have any need to make copies in the future. And a lot of these challenges to digital preservation and a lot of the different stages of digital preservation that I've talked about are represented in these different levels of digital preservation that were developed by the National Digital Stewardship Alliance. This is something that the Velt article touches on quite a bit, wanting to go from having their digital preservation efforts here in level 1 and wanting to get them as close to level 4 as possible. But you can see some of the sort of areas of concern that that this document describes. So you need to address storage. Ideally, you have at least 3 copies in geographic areas, each with a different disaster threat, right? So you need to have server space in like 3 different parts of the country. That can take resources, right? Metadata, being able to determine what metadata standards to apply, that takes a certain amount of expertise. Being able to find and fill gaps in your metadata to meet those standards. So that takes skill and expertise. Looking at integrity, I talked about fixity checks. Being able to replace or repair corrupted content as necessary. Again, that's something that it takes a certain level of skill to be able to do. Just being able to verify integrity information of content at fixed intervals, that takes different archival programs and an understanding of how to use these programs. So you can see a lot of the characteristics of digital preservation and a lot of the challenges associated with digital preservation represented in this document. So this is a great document for showing you what you should be doing. It's not a great document for this is how you do it. And especially for smaller archives like the archive at the University of Idaho that the Velt article touches on, the how to do it can be a challenge. And the article that the authors wrote about their efforts is a really great illustration of how they took steps to have a digital preservation program in place that came as close to possible as meeting more of the level 4 digital preservation efforts as opposed to level 1. So very basic, very basic, very basic, a little more, and then quite complex. And so they wanted to get here, and that article does a good job of talking about how they did it. And it seems like for the most part, they were pretty successful. Okay, so next we'll talk about some of the basic preservation strategies that archives can engage in order to preserve digital records. I don't know if any of you are into Risk at all. I remember when I was younger, some pretty long, epic Risk games. Multiple days of trying to beat your friends. So definitely a strategic game, and there's a certain amount of strategy associated with digital preservation as well. So the three that I'll touch on are copy and provide, migration, and emulation. And the Velt article talks about migration and emulation quite a bit. So I would encourage you, again, to really look closely at that article. And then copy and provide is one that they don't mention, but is also a viable strategy. Okay, so we'll start by looking at copy and provide. So this is essentially where you make your copy or copies of records in the original format. And this is what you provide to the researcher. So there's no migration involved, no emulation. You just say, okay, we're going to copy this, and then this is what we're going to put online for researchers to look at and interact with. So some benefits to this is that it can provide a high level of authenticity because there's no migration process here in the middle that can change the look, feel, and sound of the records that researchers are interacting with and looking at. It can be pretty efficient. You don't have to find a program to migrate your records. You can just copy them and boom, there you go. So that's always great. But the strategy is reliant on records being created in a format that you can use and provide to your researchers. So it's relying on records being created in something like a Word doc or something like a PDF that 99 out of 100 computers can represent with very little effort. And that relies on the choices that records creators make before records even come into archives. So for this to be successful, records have to come in to an archive on a format that is very accessible and is very easy for the archive to work with and for researchers to use. Because if the records come into the archive in a format that is difficult to provide access to, then that's where things like migration or emulation have to take place. Also, there are situations in which the record that archives get, even if it's and present to researchers, even if there's been no migration or anything that occurs, can still be quite different from what the records look like in their original format. So if records have been, hanging out on external hard drive for 10 or 15 years before they're looked at, then things like bit rot and damage from changes to the physical media can occur, and that can change the look or feel of the records, even if there isn't any migration going on. So this isn't a guarantee that what the researcher looks at is going to be exactly what the record looked like when it was created, but it's definitely a closer approximation than you're typically going to get if you do something like migration. Okay, and so we'll talk about migration next. So this is where a copy of the record in an original format comes into the archive. The record is then migrated to a different format. And then this migrated record is what the researcher interacts with. And so the look and feel and sound from the record in its original format may change due to this migration process. So anytime you change a file format for a record, it's going to change the record, right? And we talked about authenticity and the need to provide access to authentic records. Well, if this migration process changes the look and feel and sound and other aspects of a record, then again, this can cause a lot of challenges to authenticity and can undermine the authenticity of records that researchers are looking at. Which can be fine, again, as long as researchers know that what they're looking at is a migrated record, but it does undermine the authenticity of records and the overall value of the record, and in a lot of ways goes against some of the main tenets of preservation. But if this record comes into the archive on a format that is impossible or difficult for archives to use when they're making records accessible by researchers, then sometimes you just have to make do as best you can, even if there are some changes to the records after migration. And so it may be an instance where the changes to the records are fairly insubstantial. So if you're going from a TIFF file to a JPEG file, there might be some overall loss of quality. The picture might not be as sharp, the colors might change, but at the end of the day, it might not be that big of a change. And researchers will just be like, okay, well, the significant properties of this record haven't been changed to a degree where it really undermines my ability to look at and understand what I'm seeing. So migration might not be that big of a deal. But there can be instances where migration can change the look and feel of records quite a bit. If you're going from some obscure image file format to something more mainstream like a JPEG, that may create changes that are quite substantial, and it may undermine the authenticity and the look and feel of a record to a point where the significant properties of a record have been so distorted that researchers are just like, okay, well, this isn't really useful to me, and I'm going to have to find this information somewhere else, or take some other steps to find a more authentic uh, copy or presentation of this information. So in this instance, migration may be the best that archives can do, but it's creating a situation where records are much less useful for researchers. And obviously that's not what archives want to do, but sometimes, it may be what they have to do if they're having records come into an archive that are in file formats that are, for whatever reason, obsolete or very difficult to present to researchers. So kind of a necessary evil, I guess. Another strategy that I'll touch on is emulation, which the Velt article discusses briefly before dismissing it as kind of too labor intensive and just not really a valid approach for a smaller archive. So this is a process where records in the original format are emulated onto an environment where researchers are able to look at these records in a more authentic way. So if any of you are into video games, a lot of old video games have been emulated. So you can, go online or go into different video game systems and access emulators and play video games that might have been created for the Super Nintendo and play them on your PC, right? No emulator is perfect, and oftentimes, even though the representation of video game that you're looking at may be pretty similar to the original look and feel of the record, there may be instances where maybe the changes are too much. And that can be problematic for researchers as well. And this is something that the Hedstrom article talks about, using using an emulator to make the interactions with a computer game a little bit easier for researchers. And in that instance, the researchers were like, hey, this is great. The controls are easier, the controls are more responsive. We love working with the emulated version instead of working with something on the original sort of platform and process that the computer game was originally created on. So in a lot of instances, or at least in some instances, researchers are willing to sacrifice authenticity as long as that results in records being easier to see and work with. And again, that just goes to the needs of the researcher and how the researcher needs to go out meeting their information need. And so this really stems back to our discussion last week about if you're just interested in preserving the information of a record or if you're interested in preserving a record in its original format. So if you are more interested in preserving records in its original format, then that's going to impact which preservation strategy you address. If you're interested in just preserving the information, then that can influence which preservation strategy you are going to pursue as an archive. And again, these decisions ideally are made after consultation with records creators and researchers as well. So to look at emulation versus migration a little bit more, so again, you want to consider the needs of researchers. So how deep are they into their research? Are they going to use research for something that's less formal, like a presentation to a community group, or more formal, like a thesis or a governmental report, or something that is a little more influential? If that's the case, then maybe emulation or uh, copy and access might be a better choice because the records will be more authentic. If it's going to be a less formal use, then perhaps migrated records are perfectly fine, even though some changes to the records have occurred. Again, you also have to consider the ability of the archives, something that the Bell article touched on. Do you have the technical infrastructure and the staff experience and skill to carry out something like emulation, which can be very resource intensive, or do you just have to work with migration and copy and provide, even if in some instances the researcher is accessing a presentation of records which is a little bit less authentic. And also you want to look at the nature of the records. So, what is the content of the record? Is the content extremely important? In which case emulation or copy and provide might be better choices because of the level of authenticity that's maintained. Is the record going to be, does the record have strong evidential value? In which case you'll probably want something like emulation or copy and provide, again, because of the lack of challenges to a record's authenticity. So these are just some of the considerations that archives might make when they are deciding which preservation strategy to pursue. So really you can trace it all down to, are you more interested in the information and content from a record, in which case migration is going to be a good choice, or are you interested in having everything in this original format, in which case emulation, and we can throw on copy and provide are going to be better choices. And so last week we talked about the debate over whether or not the focus of preservation should be preserving the informational content or preserving records in their original format. And on page 14, Harvey essentially says that when it comes to digital preservation, in a lot of instances, archives should focus on preserving the informational content, and they need to focus less on preserving records in their original format, just because of the additional layer of complexity and difficulty that focusing on the original format and pursuing things like emulation can create. And oftentimes, again, that is sort of beyond the ability and resources that an archive has available. And so we can trace these decisions about which preservation strategies to pursue back to this idea of creation by archivists. So archivists are choosing whether or not they are going to present to researchers records that are more authentic or are in an emulated environment that results in the presentation of records that is more authentic, or if they are going to present to researchers files that have been migrated and have undergone changes to their content. And again, there are a lot of different things that can influence the choice that archives make. But in some ways, this can be a value judgment as well. So we've talked a lot about value judgments in this class. If archives think that records are particularly important and they are very determined to provide access to those records in an authentic way as possible, then they may choose to pursue things like emulation. So an example in the Velt article mentioned was the Salman Rushdie papers, which we've talked about before. If archives decide that records really aren't that important, that the content really isn't that important, then migration might be sufficient. You don't want to invest a lot of resources by emulating records that really aren't that valuable for researchers in the first place. So again, this is just another example of a lot of the value judgments related to archives and archival records that we've touched on in this class. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about digital preservation in the continuum model. So, digital preservation takes place before records come into archival custody, and it has to continue for as long as the records exist. You have to constantly be monitoring records to make sure that they're not changing. You have to migrate records. If records are in file formats, they become outdated over time. So it's a constant active interventionist policy, as we talked about, or process, as we talked about at the beginning of this lecture. It's not something that you just do once and say, okay, well, that's taken care of. You need to have this set of repeated interventions in place and be able to carry them out. And again, what that looks like is going to be described in your preservation policies. And the decisions that records creators make about files before they come into repositories can impact the digital preservation processes that archives carry out. So if records are created in file formats that are very difficult to preserve digitally, then that's going to impact the choices that archives have to make and the options that archives have when preserving digital records. If records are created in file formats that are very easy for archives to preserve digitally, then that's going to impact the choices and options that archives have as well. So this really speaks to the importance of archives working with donors ahead of time to, as much as possible, make sure that records are created in file formats that are easy to preserve into the future and that metadata associated with records remains attached with those records into the future. So if for whatever reason a record creator migrates the records themselves, that's information that archives will want to know. So archives could recommend particular software that donors can use to keep track of these changes and make sure that a sufficient level of metadata survives for archives to obtain and provide to researchers into the future. Again, just so researchers have a better understanding of the context of records and how records might have changed before they even came into the archive. Okay, we'll wrap things up by talking about some connections between digital preservation and some other aspects of archival care. So we talked about some of the overlaps between digital preservation and analog preservation. And again, this is something that the Harvey article is focused on. They argue fairly convincingly, I think, that there are some principles that unify digital preservation and analog preservation, some of which I've mentioned already in this lecture. And they have nice descriptions of what those principles are and sort of how they apply in practice. So yeah, that's a really good resource to look at to have a better understanding of how digital preservation and analog preservation are related to each other, and how there are some overlaps in the issues that that impact both types of preservation. Of course, we have to touch on appraisal. So digital preservation in the future should be something that archives consider when they're appraising records. If archives are looking at a set of records that is in a file format that is obsolete or requires a very specific type of software in order to be accessible in its most authentic form, then that might be something that leads archives to say, well, we can't really take care of these records in a way that is going to be sufficient for the needs of our researchers. So we're gonna pass on these. And that's something that we discussed when we talked about appraisal towards the beginning of this class. So weaving this idea of thinking about future preservation needs into the idea of appraisal. So similar to what the Hackbarth-Dean article talked about when we discussed preservation, about how preservation should be tied into appraisal decisions, and archives should think of the level of care and the level of infrastructure that they're able to provide to records when it comes to preservation when making appraisal choices. When archives are appraising records, it's a good time to find out about some of the significant properties of records and making sure that that they are documented, so that archives can have a better idea of which aspects of records to preserve if the records eventually do come into the archive. So, working with donors during appraisal to find out, what are the significant properties of this record? What are the things that we should really focus our preservation efforts on? So making the preservation process a little bit more directed and informed, instead of just trying to come up as an archive what might be the significant properties of records, getting a more informed choice. And also, looking at the metadata of records. Is there metadata present in records that is going to allow archives to let researchers know about the contextual nature of records, or is maybe that metadata missing? And if that metadata is missing, then maybe that informs a choice about whether to accept records or to reject them. And finally, the connection between digital preservation and arrangement and description. When archivists are carrying out arrangement and description, as I touched on before, that is a really great opportunity to discover any digital records which might need preservation in the future. So finding those external hard drives and other physical media that may contain digital records, and making sure that the preservation of those records is addressed. That's something the Bell article talks about, going through different finding aids, doing keyword searches for things like, external hard drive and so on, floppy disk. And obviously, the more thorough archives are when they're carrying out arrangement and description, the easier this discovery process will be. And if arrangement and description is done thoroughly, then records that need to be put into the digital preservation process can be identified, and they can be addressed sooner rather than later, which is something that the Harvey article promotes, this idea of intervening early before things get really bad and before records get really degraded or physical media really gets degraded. So proper arrangement and description can reduce the likelihood that records are going to come into an archive and sit on external hard drives and just rot for who knows how many years before archives know that they're there and that they need digital preservation care. Another great thing about the connection between digital preservation and arrangement and description is that when archivists are gleaning information from records for digital preservation purposes, that can be great information to use when arranging and describing records. So if you're using a program like Droid to pull out all the different file formats for records, the sizes of records, and other attributes of records, that's also information that you can use when you're arranging and describing records, right? It's basically item level description. And that's something that one of the articles that we looked at when we talked about arrangement description emphasizes being an interesting aspect of digital records is that, you can get item level information about them more efficiently than you can with analog records. And that's because of tools that were developed for digital preservation, like the Duke Data Accessioner, Droid, Bit Curator, and some of the other things that the Bell article mentions. So that's another overlap between digital preservation and arrangement description, which can be quite valuable for archivists and researchers as well. Okay, so that's it. As I've touched on, there are definitely some overlaps between analog preservation and digital preservation, just different tools, some different philosophies. Digital preservation is obviously a more active endeavor, but at the end of the day, there are a lot of overlaps. The idea of preserving context and content as authentically as possible and providing that to researchers into the accessible future. So yeah, not much more to say than that. I hope you enjoyed learning more about digital preservation. We offer an entire course, Information Studies 753, Preserving Information Media, about preservation. If you're interested in learning more about analog and digital preservation, definitely feel free to look into that. And definitely feel free to let me know if you have any questions. And as always, thank you, take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you again soon.